Okay, welcome to this Merry Musings on Bohm and Krishnamurti, where science meets spirituality. So this session was inspired by a number of books and a few conversations. The first was the Uncommon Collaboration book, which David Moody wrote about the dialogues that David Bohm and J. Krishnamurti had. And that was the first one I read. And as the friend who gave it to me intuited, there were lots of connections that resonated with me, and the perspective that they were discussing also triggered in my own thoughts about it, but also lots of resonance. And as I was looking through this book and thinking them, who else is out there who both has an integral perspective and also knows about Bohm and Krishnamurti, that kind of through a number of search synchronicities, I came across Nish Dubashia, who's with us on this call, who had written up his conversation that he'd actually had with David Bohm in a book on the unity of everything. So I was very excited to connect with Nishad, and we had a number of dialogues that are on a YouTube channel that we've set up for that. And then I went more deeply into the whole question of time, because that was an area I was really interested in. And I think it's maybe the Merry Musing after this that we go more deeply into the question of time. And so in this session, what I've done is chosen to pick a number of themes that came out for me in their work together. And as you'll see, are kind of hard to separate out from each other, which is kind of fits their whole perspective as you're trying to distinguish out, okay, there's stuff about the observer and observed, thought, time, the absolute and the relative, and yet you can't, from their perspective, really talk about one without talking about the other. So it's kind of a bit of a cosmic joke from their side that here I am trying to distinguish between these things, and the point is that they're also trying to make is it's really hard to distinguish between them in any rational kind of way. So but the way I chose to approach it was to pick out a few quotes from these books for related to each of these themes, and as you'll see, they very much overlap, and to kind of reflect on those quotes a little bit for each one, and then to go into a dialogue with Nishad about them, and then after that we open up for a conversation. So the core, of a lot of their discussions is about this question of the observer and the observed. And I'll read the quote first and then reflect on it for a moment. This is from the Moody book. Perhaps the foremost impediment to achieving a choiceless awareness, which is the goal, as it were, that they're focused on. The foremost impediment is the observer, the thinker who stands apart from the data of consciousness and feels that he or she is an independent entity who monitors, controls, and decides what course of action to take. Krishnamurti considered this sense of identity to be an illusion created by thought, not an independent or objective reality. So this is a big one. He's saying maybe the biggest issue that they saw to achieving choiceless awareness, which is a concept we can contemplate as well. But the main impediment there is the observer and the thinker who thinks of themselves as separate from the thing that they are observing. So this concept of choiceless awareness is as I contemplate and try to work out how to put it into words, it feels quite hard to put into words, but it's important because this is in a way that he's saying, this is the goal of what they were saying we need to move towards. So why choiceless awareness? I guess the point there, the place they are pointing to, and Nishad, let's pick this up in the dialogue as well, is a space where you are simply present with everything. And so there is no need to make a choice because everything is just there. And the moment that you get into the question of choice, you're introducing a bit of linearity into it and separation, because you're choosing one as opposed to the other. And this whole theme of separation is really at the core of what they are discussing, and which resonates with me because a lot of my work from evolution theory and the pain and the promise is all about how we need to go beyond this false sense of separation that we have and reestablish our sense of interconnectedness and interrelatedness with ourselves, each other, and the world around us. So as they talk about this key challenge being the way that we perceive ourselves to be separate from the world around us as an observer and the observed, that really resonates with me as being a core challenge that we're facing. Because from a kind of ethics perspective, the moment that you believe you're separate from something and that it's an objective or independent reality, as they describe out here, then you can act on that other thing as if it's not going to impact you. And that's really critical if you think about our current planetary and human condition, that we've done so much, created so much pain for other people in the great wars of the last period and continue to, and exploited so much the planet and other life on the planet as if that didn't impact us, as if it was just some kind of objective, independent world around us that we could exploit to our own ends without that actually having an effect on us. Now, obviously, the ecological crisis is reminding us that that's not the case, as most recently is the pandemic, of course. So this issue of the observer and the observed and the illusion of separation is really core to kind of their whole work. And really it is about what connects it all up is this question of separateness and linearity, that one thing after another, after another, after another, and that those go hand in hand, and that the question of thought is part of the same challenge, because the moment that one activates analytical thought about the world around us, you create it as an object out there, which you think about or name or label in some way. So then you fall into this observer observed as me, and then I engage my analytical mind to think about it. Now, it, right, third person. In itself, that doesn't have to be a problem. The problem comes when that happens in a context where we've forgotten the interconnectedness that is there as well. So the ability to distinguish things and their uniqueness and their qualities is a good thing. But the moment that that happens in a context where we don't have that deep sense of interconnectedness to parallel that experience of uniqueness of the different parts, so the moment we lose our sense of the whole as we focus on the parts, then those things become an apparent object that we can separate from ourselves and therefore act on in a way that makes us feel as if we're not being impacted by anything we do to that objective world around us. So this is kind of fundamental, focus on observe and observed. And you see here, he often references this question of thought as a key part of it. So Here's a couple more items on thought. And you'll notice, and I notice as I try to talk about this, how hard it sometimes is to find the language for it, because you're really, on one level, trying to describe the interconnectedness, and yet the nature of our language emerged with the emergence of rational thought, and it's very good at distinguishing and separating things, but harder at showing and I guess telling stories about interconnectedness. So the thinker, the observer, by its very nature, introduces an artificial division in consciousness, when in fact he or she is inseparable from the events under observation. Krishnamurti expressed this insight by declaring that the thinker is the thought, the observer is the observed. So he's trying to encourage us into a perspective where we drop the sense of separation and acknowledge that the thoughts that arise, so if we're in a classic meditation, you're kind of noticing the thoughts, that we recognize that we are also those thoughts. And it reminds me of the kind of the three-person practice where you move from third to second to first person in meditation, for example, where under the third person, you're noticing it in a very kind of, in inverted commas, objective witness position. And then you can move into a second person relationship and you say hello to whatever it is that arises in your awareness. So first there's just a noticing and letting it drift by. Second person, there's an engagement. Hello, kind of dialogue in a way. And then comes the first person where you recognize that I am that. So I am that thought as well, which is the point that Krishnamurti is pointing towards here, that the thinker is the thought. So there is me and the world around me, and there is, but yet I am that world that I am observing around me as well. So there is, you know, the taking away the boundary from the between the inner and the outer world. So here you can see how the thought, the whole process of rational thought is deeply connected with this differentiation from between the observer and the observed. A direct quote from Krishnamurti. He says, "So long as the thinker exists apart from his thoughts, which he's trying to dominate, there can be no fundamental transformation." So long as the thinker exists apart from his thoughts, which he's trying to dominate, there can be no fundamental transformation. And what's kind of key in this bit is this idea that, so we have our thoughts, and yet we try to control the thoughts somehow. So the thought becomes a thing that's observed, like something outside of us would be the observed. So we observe the thought and then we try to do something with it, as if there is no direct relationship between the person witnessing the thought and the thought itself, or the thinker and the thought. And as long as we're in that, then the ability to really connect with that thought, or really connect with the thing around us, the observed around us, you know, isn't going to happen. And yet it's through that process, it's through the relationship between the thinker and the thought, or the observer and the observed, that the transformation happens. Because if you think about it, the moment that you name something in your thought or with your language, you fix it. It's fixed as a thing. It's like, that's the mug, that's the screen, that's the lamp. And so that's it. It's fixed, right? It's been named, it's been defined, it's been bounded. There is no space for transformation. It's like, I don't know if you've watched the Matrix film, where the guy, he has this spoon and they're all about kind of bending the spoon is the trick. Of course, as long as you're thinking about it as a spoon, it doesn't bend. But the trick and the line in the film is there is no spoon. And as soon as that kind of concept is internalized, that there is what behind that is the meaning that there is no spoon as a separate thing, then they're able to bend the spoon. So there can be no transformation as long as that we live in that illusion of something having a completely independent existence as the observed, because it's locked in as an object through our thought and through our language. So this is one from David Bohm. What is the source of all this trouble? I'm saying that the source is basically in thought. I'm saying the reason we don't see the source of our problems is that the means by which we try to solve them are the source. That may seem strange to somebody who hears it for the first time, because our whole culture of prides itself based on thought as its highest achievement. I'm not suggesting that the achievements of thought are negligible. There are very great achievements in technology and culture and in various other ways, but there is another side to it, which is leading to our destruction, and we have to look at that. So the reason we don't see the source of our problems is that the means by which we try to solve them are the source. So if, as I believe, it's our illusion of separation that is at the core of our personal societal challenges at the moment, a suggestion here is that experience of separation is deeply related to our swimming in the world in rational thought. So our complete immersion in this world of rationality and thought, which by definition distinguishes and separates between things, without the remembering of the interconnectedness of all things. And so as long as we try to solve our current problems through rational thought alone, we're just going to make them worse, because, as Bohm says here, the source of the problems is the way we're trying to solve them is through thought, is through the source. And so if we kind of really let that sink in, it means that our ability to solve the challenges that we're facing in the world at the moment require us to start to use other ways of knowing beyond rational thought, more intuitive, right brain ways of knowing that come out of a place of interconnectedness, from after which we can start to engage the rational mind in the way that it's useful. But for as long as we use the rational mind to attempt to solve these problems, we're going to make them worse, because the core of the problem is separation, and thought by definition enhances that separation. Thought is an activity of the brain, whereas intelligence depends upon the inactivity or the quietness of the brain. So that points to what I was just talking about, really. This making a distinguishing between, I guess, knowledge, one might say, or intelligence, or Krishnamurti talked about insight. So where thought is kind of comes out of lots of busyness, of analysis, the intelligence they're pointing to here comes out of stillness. So that's much more the intuitive knowing. So when we learn to quieten the activity, the thought activity of the brain, that's where we're able to allow, in Krishnamurti's language, insight to drop in, or intuitive knowing, or here intelligence to emerge, but that comes from the quietness of the brain or of the analytical mind. Okay, so the relationship to time. A David Bohm quote here. If you think of Krishnamurti saying that time is not a continuity, so not linear, not a continuity, that it's just one moment after another, and each moment we just feel, there it is. Once the movement that creates the illusion of separation of observer and observed in the time process is seen to be what it actually is, i.e. an illusion, then its triviality becomes evident. So here he's connecting up, we're connecting up time, thought, the observer and the observed. And this is a really fascinating one, this question of time. So he's saying it's not a continuity. And yet he then goes on to say, but it's one moment after another. But each moment we just feel, there it is. So the experience is one of continual presence with each moment, where the mind is not busy with what might happen afterwards or what has just happened before. So our experience is about our experience of time. And they make a differentiation between, on the one hand, chronological time. So they don't deny that there is a perspective where you can see a kind of evolutionary movement from past into present into future. But the question is how you relate to that with what they call psychological time. So psychological time and chronological time. Chronological time, the kind of life process, as it were. Psychological time, how we choose to relate to that. And when we're busy in our rational minds, our relationship to that tends to be where we're either thinking about and worrying about things that we did in the past, or we're concerned or excited about something that's going to happen in the future, both of which take us out of the only thing which is actually real, which is the present moment. And so their invitation here is to be experiencing each moment in the present as it arises. And he says, once one, so it's a whole package really that goes together, that as we work on our illusion of separation between the observer and the observed, as we still the rational mind, then we start to experience time in a different way. So we start to experience it much more through presence rather than through the linearity. There's another one from the conversation Nish had with David Bohm, where Bohm said, thought attributes itself to anything, and this affects how you perceive things. That's the fundamental mistake. As long as it does that, it will inevitably bring in time. So here's the scientist, interested in time and space, and whose research into quantum physics is showing him the interconnectedness of all things, but also the deep relationship between time and space. And here he's saying, so the moment that, thought can connect to anything, it can it grabs onto something, identifies it, labels it. It says, be aware that the moment that you use your rational mind to identify something or think about it, that itself impacts your perception of it. So that's only one way of perceiving something. Another way, of course, would just be to allow something to be there in your awareness, with your stilling your rational mind and noticing how that thing speaks to you. So what impressions or what goes on in the space in between you and the thing that is in your awareness. So I can look outside the window and see the tree out there, and I can go, oh, that's a tree. Hello, tree. You know, and kind of look at it. What kind of tree is it? Or maybe it's an oak tree. But that doesn't create a relationship between me and the tree. The moment that I still my mind and just allow it to be there and allow myself to be there, then a different quality of observing emerges. That is actually much more about the relationship than about the object, the thing out there. So you've got this thought process going on that is creating a space between things, differentiating things, creating space between you and the other. Now, and then he says, as long as it does that, this will bring in time. Well, how does that work? And in their dialogues, says, well, look, this is my interpretation of it. If you've got yourself here and you identify something as separate out there, then for you to go from here to there is going to take time, because you've put space between the two of you. You've created a separation between the two of you, and you've created a separation of space that also then brings in, by definition, a separation in time, because for you to get there, you're going to need to take time to move there. So the emergence of rational thought, the emergence of the language that we use now, abstract language to label things, came at the same time as the emergence of linear time in terms of how we experience the reality around us. So this all happened around the time that we moved from our existence in tribes and a tribal consciousness, pre-rational, pre-cognitive, to our emergence into the agricultural civilization and the feudal empires. And in that transition, we developed a sense of separate self. We developed a sense of me and the other, and therefore we developed language to be able to label something, for us to be able to think about something, and for us to be able to think linearly, which is why with agriculture, you know, the first time that we actually thought, okay, let's plant something and wait for the future until we can harvest it. So that emergence of our sense of separate self is a parallel with the emergence of linear time, abstract thought, and language. Now, as I said before, that in itself is not a bad thing. It gives us, it greatly accelerates our development, because we can actually explore things and discover them and find out about their unique qualities and characteristics. The problem only comes when we then forget about that experience of interconnectedness that we had before that sense of separate self emerged. And that's the theme of the Pain and the Promise, Merry Musing from earlier on in the series. So this kind of brings us to a fundamental question around, so what is it that they are trying to point us towards? The issue that they seem to have is with the relative, inverted commas, world. So with this world of separation and our experience of it as being separate. But what are they pointing us towards on the other side? And they had a slightly different take on this. And these are Moody's words, where Bohm and Krishnamurti part company lies in whether the ground of all that is the final and ultimate source of the universe, the end and the beginning, or whether additional levels or layers of reality may exist beyond that. So that's kind of hard to, see how language doesn't really help us here. So how, is the ground of all that is the final and ultimate source? Well, that seems to be by definition. If it's the ground of all that is, then surely, right? But then, so what were they actually talking about here? Krishnamurti was emphatic in stating that the ground to which he was referring was final and ultimate. So Krishnamurti saying there is some kind of absolute context where there is nothing more. That's it. David Bohm says, is this ground the absolute end of everything? In our proposed views concerning the general nature of the totality of all that is, we regard even this ground as a mere stage, in the sense that there could in principle be an infinity or further development beyond it. So that's a good one. It's very hard to go into in language because of the relative nature of language. But the way I would explain it, and that Nishad and I have discussed before, also inspired by Ken Wilber's insights, is on the one hand, you have the relative world that we're in, right? All the stuff around us. At the same time, we know that we can also have an experience which feels like it's an experience of the absolute, so an experience of oneness. Now, the fact that we can experience that oneness, does that therefore mean that all of this relative world is an illusion? Well, no, why should it? Because it's all here right in front of me. So you've got the absolute and the relative coexisting side by side. And the ability to hold both of those aspects of our experience is what Ken Wilber would call the non-dual perspective. So there may be a sense that they were lacking that distinction in their dialogue, being able to talk about having the absolute experience of the absolute on the one hand, and for the relative to be coexisting, and to be able to hold both of those in a non-dual perspective, because of course absolute relative is dual. So there's got to be something beyond that that unifies the two, and Wilber and others have called it the non-dual. So maybe that distinction, but making sure we distinguish between the absolute and the non-dual on the one hand, can help to resolve this. Good. So I'll stop the presentation there and invite Nishad to join me here. Nishad, great. Lots of common themes there, I think, that we've explored.
Yes, indeed, yes.
Period. But maybe you just like to start by just tell us a little bit about your background with Bohm and Krishnamurti shortly, so people have some context for it, and then we can go into a little dialogue.
Sure, thank you. Yes, I came across Bohm and Krishnamurti when I was a university student about 30 years ago, and I was a mathematics student with an interest in physics. So I came across Bohm's implicate order theory, and I was also interested in philosophy and Eastern thinking, and that's what led me to discover and read and study Krishnamurti in some detail. And I was lucky enough to go and attend several talks by Krishnamurti, have a brief meeting with him. And a few years later, I actually wrote a paper, because what my main interest was at that time, what is it that the different religions and philosophies have in common? So I developed a model to try to get that across, and I sent that to David Bohm, and he very kindly agreed to talk with me, invited me to talk with him, and that's the dialogue that is recorded in the book that Peter mentioned earlier, The Unity of Everything. So that's how I came across them, met them both, spent some time with them both. And they've informed my thinking and practice ever since. Sorry, I think I've lost you. I can't hear
No,
you.
there we go. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So so I've done what I can in a short period of time to touch on some of the core themes. How would you describe in your language the kind of essence of their quest together, as it were? What is it that they were really pursuing as an inquiry?
I think they were pursuing two interrelated themes, which are different but also interrelated. The first was the question of human suffering and human conflict, and that was Krishnamurti's main quest throughout his 60 years of teaching, which is that why do human beings suffer, and what can we do to resolve this suffering? And that led him to investigate the process of human thinking. What is it about human thinking that is causing us to have so much conflict in the world? And that's, I think, the first half, if you like, of what Krishnamurti and Bohm would discuss. And I refer to that half as the freedom from the known half. So that's how can we free ourselves from our conditioning and enter into a state of choiceless awareness, where we can be aware of things without our own beliefs and conditioning and linear thought processes imposing themselves on that perception. And then I think the second aspect of what they were discussing went even beyond that, which is what is the ultimate nature of reality. And that's where they started to talk about what they refer to as the ground of all being, which lies completely beyond thinking, and completely beyond anything that the mind, the conceptual mind, can understand. So I think the first of these aspects, if you like, led to the second one. There's a freedom from the known, and that leads us into a state of perception which they refer to as the ending of time. So I would say these are their two main aspects: freedom from the known and the ending of time.
Great, thanks. And on that, on this kind of ground of all being, it seems that they, for a long time, you know, as I was reading the dialogues, they circle around it again and again, and have trouble kind of getting to some because of course the difficulty of language and being able to describe this, but trouble in getting to a kind of coherent agreement with each other on what that really is, as we saw from some of the quotes. How would you describe their their different perceptions of this ground of all being, or what was that? Why was it so hard for them to somehow be able to find a way to describe it that they both were able to resonate with?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I think they were coming from different backgrounds. Krishnamurti was talking as an awakened mystic, and Bohm was talking as a unusually deep thinking physicist. So when Krishnamurti said that the ground is something beyond which there is nothing, I think he was coming from his own experience of the absolute. He'd had some kind of experience of the absolute, what he believed was the absolute, and that to him was the beginning and the ending of everything, that there can't be anything beyond that. But I think if one hasn't experienced that, which maybe Bohm hadn't, then it's maybe difficult to grasp that conceptually. So from Bohm's point of view, there is this endlessly deepening relative world. And how can that possibly just arbitrarily come to an end point? So I think that was probably the difficulty. It was a scientist with a conceptual mind and insight talking to a mystic who we could assume was an awakened mystic and had actually experienced this.
Yeah, it makes me think of a distinction in the integral model between two stages, the kind of yellow integral stage and the holistic turquoise in the spiral dynamics model. And the way I've described the difference before is that one starts from all the parts and gets that they're all interconnected, but in a way sees the whole as the kind of sum of all these parts. Right? The other starts from an intuitive knowing of the whole, and then notices that there are parts kind of within that whole, And maybe it's that Bohm, with his scientific kind of background, was focused more on the parts, of course, was seeing this great interconnectedness of it all, but didn't have that experience of the whole in the way that Krishnamurti does, where his starting point, Krishnamurti, is the whole, is the oneness. Bohm's starting point is the parts. Would that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's almost exactly what I'm saying. Yeah, I think there is a difference between thinking of the absolute as merely the totality of the relative, which perhaps is what Bohm was conceiving it as, and the absolute as being as transcending and also including the relative, if you like.
Right.
And you need to actually have experienced or intuitively felt rather than just conceptually understood. I think the latter. Which I think is probably the difference between yellow and turquoise. And yellow is you're more you're a thinker who feels, whereas at turquoise it's the feeling aspect becomes more dominant, and the thinking is something you can use as a tool, but it doesn't identify or exhaust who you are.
And just on the themes that I was kind of trying to touch on during the talk just now, are there any elements that you'd add something to or go into a bit more, as you know, where you were thinking, oh yeah, and there was this, or yes, and there's this perspective on it?
I thought it was interesting. I mean, the distinction they make between the observer and the observed, I think, is the essence of what they were talking about. If we had to sum it up in one concept or one intuition, and if one can be simply present, as you were saying, present and choicelessly aware of how we create that difference between the thought and the thinker, and then we can eventually come to a realization that the thought is actually just, sorry, the thinker is actually just another thought that we're creating. It's not, it doesn't have its own true independent existence. We're inventing the idea of the thinker using thought. And if we can come across that insight, then it raises the possibility that we can then use thought intelligently where it's required, what Krishnamurti referred to as the technological thinking. We use it for practical purposes. But what Krishnamurti referred to as psychological thinking, where thought runs away with itself, loses sight of the underlying whole, imagines that there is a thinker who is controlling all of the thoughts, then that's where the trouble starts. What I always found puzzling in the early days when I started to read this is, well, how do we know when to use thought and when not to use thought? Who's actually deciding that? And what I gradually came to understand is that when the mind becomes quiet through this insight into the nature of thinking and the illusory nature of the thinker, a different kind of intelligence awakens, which perhaps was only implicit before. And that intelligence has its own inherent knowing of when thought is appropriate and when thought is not appropriate. It's no longer something we need to control. It's something that this new intelligence that arises out of choiceless awareness is able to, I don't want to say take control of, but out of that intelligence, the appropriate use of thinking arises.
So in a way, it's led by intelligence or intuition, and then the thinking is in service to that movement rather than thought leading us.
Exactly. And the one word you used was presence, which I think is a very, very good word to use for that. The presence becomes one's dominant mode of being, and it uses conceptual thinking, but it's no longer bound to conceptual thinking, and it no longer mistakes the products of conceptual thinking for objectively real entities. It's aware of what it's doing. It's aware that thinking is just its own creation, its own tool. Whereas most of us, we're trapped in thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But it's presence that enables us to go beyond that.
Yeah. Now, I remember in one of our conversations, and maybe it's in your model, you make a really useful distinction between the rational mind's ability to distinguish between things and then what happens when we forget about their interconnectedness. And I think that latter is you refer to as fragmentation, right? And but that was an important distinction. Could you just say a little bit about that? Do you know, I can't remember what the first word was.
Multiplicity.
Right. Multiplicity and fragmentation. Yeah.
So yes, I mean, David Bohm makes a very useful, critical, I think, distinction between what he calls the parts and the fragments. So just because we are, if you like, coming upon an understanding of this underlying wholeness, that doesn't mean that we want to be stuck in the whole, if you like. Parts, making distinctions and recognizing differences is essential for living. So parts have their place. The problem arises when we lose sight of the whole that is underlying the parts. And then we think the parts themselves, the distinctions and differences themselves, are ultimately real. And at that point, the parts become what David Bohm refers to as fragments. So we move from multiplicity, which is the naturally occurring and useful divisions, into fragmentation, where the divisions become destructive divisions. So for example, there is a certain level at which it makes sense to talk about people belonging to different races, for example. That if we recognize the underlying wholeness of humanity and we don't lose sight of that, then there's no problem in saying that this person is French and this person is German. But if we lose sight of that underlying wholeness, then the parts become fragments. We identify very tightly with those distinctions, and then different races go to war with one another. So what is required with what they both refer to as the awakening of intelligence is to be able to, or rather there arises this natural ability to operate in the field of the wholes and the parts. But because you never lose sight of the whole, you never descend into fragmentation. And that's how you resolve a lot of human conflict that way.
Yeah, great description. And yeah, you're a really critical differentiation. Yeah, because there are also traditions I've come across, that do seem to dismiss the relative, like it's all a dream, it's all, it's all an illusion, there is only the whole. And yet here we are, yet we have actually chosen to incarnate in this relative world. So it always feels so down, so degrading and so unappreciative of life. And when I hear that perspective, but there's obviously some kind of confusion going on there where they've lost sight of the relative, or mistaken again the absolute for the non-dual in some way.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, I think traditions that do that, for example, Vedanta in Hinduism, to some degree Theravada in Buddhism, I think it's dangerous. It can be quite a dangerous position to take. First of all, it's incomplete, as you say, because we're not incorporating and acknowledging this world of differences that seems so obviously real. But I think the bigger danger actually is that it means we can look at human suffering and not take it seriously and say that it's an illusion. So we look at all these terrible things happening and we don't really care because it's not real in some sense. So that's why I think the whole and the part both need to be taken equally seriously.
Yeah.
Which is what I think Bohm and Krishnamurti do. Yeah.
And before we move into the discussion with the group, one last question. What would you say is the biggest implications of their work if we were to kind of accept their thesis, as it were, accept their teachings? What do you feel would be the biggest implications of that for us individually and collectively?
Well, I would say the biggest implication in practical terms probably would be that we have to let go of this belief that is so dominant in Western culture, certainly, but increasingly around the world, that human conceptual thinking is the pinnacle of our achievement, and that conceptual thinking is what will solve all of our problems. If we can just think in the right way, we'll sort it all out. And that's an illusion. That I think is perhaps the most practical implication of what they're saying, which is to realize the limitations of conceptual thinking, which at the moment we idolize. We see it as our savior, but actually it may be, when wrongly used, it may be actually the cause of our problems.
That's such a big one, isn't it? Because we're still, however, even, you know, when people are committed to sustainability or trying to change the world and everything else, we still essentially come at it from the rational mind, right? Try to work out the problem, think up the solution. And as Bohm says in one of those quotes, you know, but that's the source of the problem. So that's a huge challenge for us to actually be able to move beyond that and start to allow solutions to emerge from presencing, really, from the foundation of interconnectedness as opposed to the foundation of separation. And wow, for us to get, that's at one level, like, you know, it's hopeful to know what's needed. At the other hand, it's depressing to think what it might take for actually people to actually, you know, move there, given how, you know, how rational, the whole rational thought perspective and the whole linearity of everything is so embedded in our culture and our education and in everything. You know, it's a tough one. But good. Well, it's clear what the challenge is anyway.